The steady rhythm of raindrops filled the sleek black sedan as it glided to a stop. Richard Kingsley stepped out, one hand gripping his umbrella, the other clutching his phone. "I understand the board's concerns, Marcus," Richard said, his voice tense. "But I've built this company from nothing, and I won't let it be dismantled by short-term thinking." His attention remained fixed on the quarterly projections glowing on his screen. Rainwater pooled around his Italian leather shoes as pedestrians moved around him like a stream around a boulder. A sharp gust of wind caught his umbrella. As he shifted to regain control, his wallet, a sleek black calfskin billfold, slipped from his coat pocket, landing with a splash on the wet concrete. "Damn it," Richard muttered, watching helplessly as it skidded toward a storm drain, tipping over the edge and disappearing into darkness below. Just as Richard was calculating the inconvenience, a small figure darted toward the drain and dropped to its knees. A boy, perhaps 10 or 11, plunged his face against the wet concrete to peer into the drain, arm stretching down impossibly far. The child was soaked through, his oversized navy hoodie dark with rainwater, jeans muddied at the knees. After a moment of concentration, the boy let out a small sound of triumph. His arm emerged, hand clutching the dripping wallet. "Thank you," Richard said, genuine surprise in his voice. "That was unexpected." The boy stood, wiped the wallet against his already soaked hoodie, and held it out. His face remained partially hidden beneath the hood, but Richard could see earnest eyes looking up at him. "You dropped this, mister," the boy said, voice soft but steady. Richard knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the child. For the first time that day, perhaps that week, Richard actually looked at another person. Really looked. The boy's eyes were a startling shade of green, flecked with gold. Unusual eyes, somehow familiar. His face was thin but healthy, framed by damp strands of sandy brown hair. "That was very honest of you," Richard said, accepting the wallet. "Most people would have just kept it." The boy shrugged. "It's not mine," he said simply. Richard felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. He reached for his wallet, intending to offer a reward. "Please leave a like and sub, and comment where you're watching from," he said automatically, a remnant from his company's latest social media initiative. He caught himself immediately. The boy tilted his head, perplexed. Richard cleared his throat, embarrassed. "Sorry, force of habit from work," he muttered. "What I meant to say was, let me give you something for your trouble." As Richard flipped open the wallet, intending to extract a few bills, something caught his eye. Nestled between his platinum card and ID was a corner of aged paper. He pulled it out, revealing a small sepia-toned photograph. The world around him, the rain, traffic, pedestrians, faded into a distant hum. In his hand was a photograph of a little girl, perhaps 4 years old. She had pigtails tied with ribbon and wore a yellow sundress. Around her neck hung a small tear-shaped pendant. She was laughing, head thrown back in uncomplicated joy. It was a face he hadn't seen in 15 years, except in his dreams. "Emily," he whispered, the name escaping like a prayer. Richard's hands began to tremble. This photograph couldn't be here. The only pictures of his sister had been in his parents' house when it burned down 5 years after her disappearance. He looked up sharply at the boy, who stood watching him with those unusual, familiar eyes. "Where did you get this?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible over the rain. "How did this get in my wallet?" But the boy was no longer standing before him. In the brief moment Richard had been lost in shock, the child had vanished. Richard shot to his feet, scanning the crowded sidewalk. Pedestrians rushed past, a sea of umbrellas and raincoats, but the small figure in the navy hoodie was nowhere to be seen. He could walk away, continue his life as planned. Board meetings, acquisitions, the familiar comfort of power and control. Or he could follow the only lead he'd had in 15 years to the greatest loss of his life. The rain fell harder, soaking through his expensive suit. Richard Kingsley, who had built an empire on logical decisions, made a choice based purely on something he'd denied himself for years. Hope. He stepped into the crowd, searching for a small boy in a navy hoodie, the photograph clutched tightly. In his hand. The photograph trembled between Richard's fingers as memories crashed through the careful barriers he'd constructed over 15 years. Summer. 2010. The Kingsley family lake house. 7-year-old Richard sits cross-legged on the dock, squinting in concentration as he threads a small pendant onto a delicate silver chain. The pendant is tear-shaped, made of blue sea glass. He found that day. "Careful now," his father says, watching nearby. "Those small clasps are tricky." Richard's tongue pokes out slightly as he works. "It's for Emmy," he explains unnecessarily. "For her birthday." From the shore comes a high-pitched squeal of delight. Richard looks up to see his mother chasing his little sister in circles on the narrow beach. Emily is 4, a whirlwind in a yellow sundress, her pigtails bouncing as she runs. "Emmy," Richard calls, waving the necklace. "I made you something." She stops and turns, her small face lighting up. She races toward the dock, little feet kicking up sand. "Careful," their mother calls after her. "Don't run on the dock." But Emily is too excited. She crashes into him with the full-body hug only small children can give. Richard helps her put on the necklace, his small fingers struggling with the clasp as she stands impatiently. When it finally closes, the pendant rests just below her collarbone, catching the sunlight. "I'll never, ever take it off," she declares with the absolute certainty of childhood. 3 weeks later, she vanishes from the local playground while their mother looks away for less than 2 minutes. The pendant goes with her. Present day. The rain had intensified, plastering Richard's suit to his body. He barely noticed. The photograph had ripped open a wound he'd spent 15 years trying to suture closed. Richard scanned the crowded sidewalk frantically, searching for the boy in the navy hoodie. There, a flash of dark blue moving against the flow of pedestrians. Richard pushed forward, shouldering past startled business people. His umbrella caught in the wind and inverted. He let it go without a second thought. As he rounded a corner, Richard slammed into a crowd waiting at a crosswalk. He craned his neck, searching desperately for the boy. The crowd surged forward as the light changed. Richard moved with them, scanning faces. Nothing. Then, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Half a block ahead, the boy was watching him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Richard felt a jolt of recognition that went beyond their recent encounter. The boy turned and darted down a set of stairs leading to the subway. Richard didn't hesitate. He raced after him, taking the wet steps 2 at a time. The sound of his dress shoes slapping against tiles echoed as he vaulted over the turnstile, ignoring the shout from the booth attendant. The platform was crowded. A train was already there. Doors open, passengers streaming in and out, and there, at the far end, the boy was stepping onto the train. "Wait!" Richard shouted, breaking into a sprint. The warning tone sounded, doors closing. Richard lunged forward, sliding between them at the last possible second. He stumbled into the crowded car, scanning faces around him. In the final car, Richard spotted him. The boy stood alone at the far end, his face partially hidden by the navy hood. Richard moved toward him, careful not to lose sight of him again. The train lurched into motion. By the time Richard regained his footing, the boy had moved to the door between cars. "Please," Richard called, softer now. "I just want to talk to you." The boy hesitated, hand on the door. Then the train entered a tunnel, plunging the car into strobing darkness, and the boy pushed through. Richard followed, bursting into the space between cars. The roar of the tracks below was deafening. Rain and wind whipped through the open sides. "The photograph," Richard called over the noise. "The girl in the picture, she's my sister. She disappeared 15 years ago. Please, I need to know how you got it." The boy paused, looking back at Richard. In the dim lighting, Richard could see him clutching something to his chest. The photograph. "She's still lost," the boy said, his voice barely audible over the train's roar. Before Richard could respond, the train screeched as it began to slow. The sudden deceleration threw him against the side railing. By the time he righted himself, the boy had vanished through the door. Richard followed, pushing into the next car just as the train stopped. The doors slid open, and passengers poured out. Richard caught a glimpse of the navy hoodie and moved quickly. The station was deep, with long corridors branching off the main platform. Richard followed the boy down one of these, their footsteps echoing against tiled walls. The crowd thinned until it was just the two of them in a narrow passage. The boy stopped at a junction where the corridor split in 3 directions. He turned to face Richard, still clutching the photograph. "Why did you stop looking for her?" the boy asked, his voice small but clear. The question hit Richard like a physical blow. He took a step back. "I never stopped," he whispered hoarsely. Not really. It was both truth and lie. The active searching had eventually ceased. Life had carried on. Richard had built his company, accumulated wealth and power. But inside, he had remained frozen in time, a 7-year-old boy who had failed to protect his sister. "You stopped," the boy insisted, taking a step backward. "You built walls and towers and forgot her face." Richard shook his head, water dripping from his hair. "How could you possibly know that? Who are you?" Instead of answering, the boy held out the photograph. "She keeps this with her," he said, "to remember you." Richard's heart stuttered. "Keeps," he repeated, seizing on the present tense. "What? Do you mean? Is Emily alive?" The boy's eyes widened as if he'd said too much. He took another step backward, then turned and bolted down the rightmost corridor. "No!" Richard shouted, racing after him. "Wait!" The corridor stretched endlessly, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering erratically. They burst through emergency doors into a maintenance tunnel. The lighting here was even worse, bare bulbs spaced far apart. The tunnel opened suddenly into a vast chamber, an abandoned station platform. Construction equipment lay scattered about, covered in dust. The boy darted behind a stack of concrete pylons. Richard slowed to a walk, trying to control his breathing. "I've been searching for my sister for 15 years, he said, knowing the boy was listening. "I never wanted to stop, but after a while, hope becomes painful." Silence answered him. Richard moved cautiously around the pylons. "My name is Richard Kingsley," he continued, turning slowly, scanning the shadows. "Emily was my sister. She disappeared when she was 4 years old. I was 7. A small sound came from behind a rusted piece of machinery. Richard approached it slowly. The pendant in the photograph, I made it for her birthday. Sea glass on a silver chain. No one could know that unless... The boy emerged from the shadows, still clutching the photograph. His hood had fallen back, revealing his face fully. "She said you gave it to her," the boy said quietly. "She never takes it off." Richard's legs nearly gave way beneath him. He steadied himself against a concrete pillar. "You've seen her," he whispered. "Recently. She's alive." The boy nodded once, a small, hesitant movement. "Where is she?" Richard asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. The boy took a step toward him, then froze as a loud rumble shook the chamber. Dust and small pieces of concrete rained down from the ceiling. "Not here," the boy said, glancing nervously at the ceiling. "It's not safe." As if to emphasize his point, a larger chunk of concrete crashed to the floor near them. The impact echoed through the chamber. "Then let's go somewhere safe," Richard said, extending his hand. "You can tell me everything you know about Emily." The boy studied Richard's outstretched hand. Another rumble shook the station. "They told me not to trust anyone," the boy said, "especially not you." Richard's heart sank. "Who told you that? Why?" Before the boy could answer, a deafening crack split the air. A support beam near the ceiling gave way, sending a cascade of debris toward them. Richard lunged forward without thinking, tackling the boy out of the path of the falling concrete. They rolled across the dusty floor as chunks of ceiling smashed. Into the ground where they had been standing. They lay there, coughing in the cloud of dust. Richard's arms remained protectively around the small body beside him. When the dust began to settle, Richard sat up. "Are you hurt?" The boy shook his head, eyes wide with shock. He looked at Richard with newfound uncertainty, as if re-evaluating everything he'd been told. Richard got to his feet, pulling the boy up with him. "We need to get out of here before the rest comes down." He spotted an emergency exit and pointed. "That way." Together they ran across the unstable platform, dodging falling debris. They reached the exit just as another support gave way behind them. The emergency door opened onto a maintenance stairwell. They climbed quickly, the sounds of destruction fading below them. At the top, another door led them back into the main subway system. The boy made no move to run. Instead, he looked up at Richard with a changed expression, something like cautious trust. "You saved me," he said, sounding surprised. Richard nodded, still catching his breath. "Of course I did." The boy seemed to come to a decision. He held out the photograph. "She wants to come home," he said quietly, "but they won't let her." Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with his rain-soaked clothes. "Who won't let her?" he asked, taking the photograph with trembling fingers. The boy glanced nervously over his shoulder. "I can take you to her," he said, "but we have to be careful. They're watching." "Who's watching?" Richard pressed. Instead of answering, the boy turned toward the busy station beyond. "We need to go above ground," he said. "I know a place where we can talk, where it's safe." Richard hesitated only, briefly. The logical part of him warned this could be a con, but there was the pendant, a detail no one could know. "Lead the way," Richard said, making his choice. They emerged from the subway into a different part of the city. The rain had eased, to a gentle mist that hung in the air like a veil. Richard's soaked suit clung uncomfortably to his skin, but he barely noticed. His focus remained on the small figure walking slightly ahead of him. The boy moved with purpose through streets that grew progressively narrower and less familiar. Gone were the gleaming skyscrapers of Midtown. They had entered a neighborhood of crowded tenements and small bodegas with neon signs flickering against the darkening sky. Richard's phone had been buzzing incessantly. Marcus, no doubt, concerned about his disappearance before the board meeting. Richard silenced it without looking. "Where are we going?" Richard asked as they turned down a particularly narrow street lined with fire escapes. The boy glanced back, those unusual eyes catching the glow of a nearby streetlight. "Somewhere they don't look," he said cryptically. "And who exactly are they?" Richard pressed, his patience wearing thin. The boy slowed, considering Richard carefully. "The people who took her," he said finally. "The ones who've been keeping her all this time." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. "Are you saying my sister was kidnapped? That she's been held captive for 15 years? The boy's expression was unreadable. "Not exactly," he said. "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicate it for me," Richard said, frustration edging into his voice. The boy stopped abruptly, turning to face Richard fully. "They told her you stopped looking," he said, a challenge in his voice. "They showed her newspaper articles about your company, your success. They said you moved on, that you forgot about her." The accusation stung like a physical blow. Richard took a step back, guilt threatening to overwhelm him. "I never forgot her," he said quietly. "Never. But after years of searching, of false leads and dead ends, we thought she was dead." "But you didn't know for sure," the boy countered. "You chose to believe it because it was easier." Richard nodded, acknowledging the truth. "You're Right, he admitted. I should have kept looking. I should never have given up on her. Something in the boy's expression softened, as if surprised by Richard's admission. She didn't give up on you, the boy said, his voice gentler now, even when they told her to. Richard swallowed hard. How do you know all this? How do you know Emily? The boy hesitated, then reached into the pocket of his hoodie and withdrew, a small object. He held it out in his palm, a pendant made of blue sea glass on a tarnished silver chain. She gave me this, he said, to prove who I am when I found you. Richard stared at the pendant, identical to the one in the photograph, the one he'd made for his sister's 4th birthday. He reached out with shaking fingers to touch it. This is impossible, he whispered. How did you get this? I told you, the boy said. She gave it to me, to help me find you. Richard looked from the pendant to the boy's face, studying his features more carefully. The shape of his nose, the set of his jaw, there was something hauntingly familiar about them. Who are you? Richard asked again, his voice barely audible. Before the boy could answer, the squeal of tires echoed from the end of the street. A black SUV with tinted windows turned sharply onto the narrow road, its headlights cutting through the misty rain. The boy's face drained of color. They found us, he said, voice tight with fear. He grabbed Richard's wrist, the pendant still clutched in his hand. Run! They bolted down the street, the boy leading Richard through a maze of alleyways. Behind them, car doors slammed and shouted commands echoed off brick walls. Heavy footsteps splashed through puddles, gaining on them with every turn. They burst out onto a larger street, directly in front of an arriving subway train. The boy pulled Richard toward the opening doors. Get in, he urged. They leaped into the crowded car just as the doors began to close. Through the window, Richard caught a glimpse of men in dark clothing pushing through pedestrians, searching frantically. As the train pulled away, Richard collapsed onto an empty seat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The boy remained standing, peering anxiously out the window until the station disappeared from view. Who were those men? Richard demanded when he could speak again. The boy sank onto the seat beside him, still clutching the pendant. The people who've been watching her, he said, making sure she doesn't leave. Are they the ones who took her? The boy shook his head. Not exactly. They're protectors, in their way, but they don't want her to go back to her old life. They think it's too dangerous. Richard's mind raced. Dangerous for whom? Why would reuniting with her family be dangerous? Because of what she knows, the boy said, lowering his voice. Because of what she saw the day she disappeared. A chill ran down Richard's spine. What did she see? The boy glanced around nervously as if afraid of being overheard. I can't tell you here, he said. We need to get to the meeting place first. Richard bit back his frustration. Every answer seemed to lead to more questions. Fine, he said. Where is this meeting place? Not far now, the boy replied. 3 more stops. They rode in tense silence, both watching the doors at each station. Richard used the time to study the boy more carefully. He was small for his age, which Richard now guessed to be around 11 or 12. His clothes were worn, but clean. Not a street child, then. Someone was taking care of him. What's your name? Richard asked finally. The boy hesitated, then said, Thomas, but everyone calls me Tom. And how old are you, Tom? 11, the boy replied. Richard did the math quickly. 11 years. His sister had disappeared 15 years ago when she was 4. That made her 19 now. Is Emily your mother? Richard asked suddenly, the possibility hitting him. Tom's eyes widened in surprise, then he shook his head vehemently. No, nothing like that. Then what? Richard pressed. How do you know her? Tom opened his mouth to respond, but the train's brakes screeched as they approached another station. This is us, he said instead, rising to his feet. Come on. They exited onto a platform Richard didn't recognize. Tom led the way to a service exit, pushing through a door marked Emergency. Use only. Beyond was a narrow utility corridor that smelled of damp concrete. Their footsteps echoed as they walked, the fluorescent lights spaced far apart, creating pools of illumination separated by stretches of shadow. Are you sure this is the right way? Richard asked, his unease growing. Tom nodded without looking. Back. It's a shortcut. Keeps us off the main concourse where cameras might spot us. Cameras? You mean security cameras? And other kinds, Tom said cryptically. They reached a junction where the corridor split into 3 branches. Tom took the leftmost path without hesitation. The lighting grew dimmer, the air cooler. Richard's instincts for self-preservation began to sound warning bells. He was following a stranger through the bowels of the subway system, based only on a photograph and a pendant that could be forgeries. Yet something deeper than logic kept him moving forward. Something in Tom's eyes, in the way he spoke of Emily, with respect and concern rather than the calculated precision of a con artist. The corridor ended at a heavy metal door. Tom pushed it open, revealing a vast underground chamber that took Richard's breath away. It was an abandoned platform, far larger than the one they'd fled earlier, but unlike that crumbling space, this one had been transformed. The soaring ceiling was intact, its ornate tilework from a bygone era still visible, beneath decades of grime. Old-fashioned globe lights hung from chains, casting a warm glow across the space. Along one wall ran a series of makeshift rooms constructed from salvaged materials. Plywood, canvas, old doors repurposed as walls. People moved between these structures, a dozen or so figures of various ages, all with the watchful alertness Richard had noticed in Tom. "What is this place?" Richard asked, his voice hushed with amazement. "Home," Tom replied simply, "for those of us who need to stay hidden." Richard stood frozen at the threshold of this underground community, trying to process what he was seeing. A hidden society beneath the streets of the city. Tom tugged at his sleeve. "Come on, we shouldn't stand here." A teenage girl approached, eyeing Richard suspiciously. "What is he doing here?" she asked Tom sharply. "You know the rules." "It's okay." "Leah," Tom replied. "He's Emily's brother." Leah studied Richard more carefully. "You're sure?" Tom nodded. "I found him, just like she asked." Richard's patience wore thin. "I need to see my sister. Now." "She's not here," Leah finally said. "They moved her after she gave Tom the pendant. They knew she was planning something." "Who are they?" Richard demanded. "And what does any of this have to do with my sister's disappearance?" Before either could answer, a young man burst through a door. "They're coming! Police, private security. They've got the tunnel sealed off." Community erupted into controlled chaos. People gathered belongings. Children were ushered toward hidden exits. A man in his late 40s approached. Despite shabby surroundings, he carried himself with authority. "You're Richard Kingsley," he said. Richard nodded. "And you are?" "Someone who's been protecting your sister for a very long time," the man replied. "I'm Garrett." Richard tensed. "Where is she? What have you done with her?" "We haven't done anything to her. We've been keeping her safe." The distant sound of boots echoed through the chamber. Garrett glanced toward the noise. "We don't have time for this," he said, turning to Leah. "Get everyone out through the north passage." Leah nodded and moved away. Garrett returned to Richard. "Your sister is at our secondary location," he said. "If you want to see her, you'll have to trust us." "Trust you?" Richard scoffed. "I don't know why you've kept my sister from her family for 15 years. Because her family couldn't protect her from them." "From who?" Before Garrett could answer, the sound of breaking wood erupted from the tunnel. Flashlight beams cut through. The dimness. "We need to move," Garrett said urgently. "Tom, bring him." Tom grabbed Richard's arm. "Please, we have to go." Richard hesitated, torn between suspicion and the possibility of finding Emily. A group of men in tactical gear appeared at the far end of the platform. Among them, Richard spotted a familiar emblem on their uniforms, a stylized eagle clutching a globe. The same emblem from the detective who had handled Emily's disappearance 15 years ago. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whatever was happening here went beyond a simple kidnapping. "This way," Tom urged, pulling Richard toward a narrow gap between two structures. As they slipped through, Richard caught a glimpse of the underground community being stormed. The men moved with military precision, but they weren't police. Not with that emblem. They passed through a maze of passages, joining others fleeing the raid. After several minutes, they emerged into a larger tunnel that appeared to be part of an abandoned subway system. "I saw the emblem on those men's uniforms," Richard said to Garrett. "Global Security Solutions. They handled my sister's case 15 years ago." Garrett's expression remained impassive. "And now, you're beginning to understand. The private security firm my parents hired to find Emily seems to be the same one keeping her hidden." "Why?" Garrett withdrew a small flash drive from his pocket. "Your sister discovered something she wasn't supposed to see," he said. "Something that powerful people would kill to keep hidden. That's why she was taken. Not by us, by them." "So, who are you people?" "We're the ones who got her out," Garrett said. "Former agents who couldn't stomach what was happening. We've been hiding her, and others, ever since." What could a 4-year-old possibly have seen that would justify all this? "She wasn't the target," Garrett explained. "Your father was." Richard felt the ground shift beneath him. "My father? He was an accountant for a shipping company." "A shipping company that was a front for something darker," Garrett said. "Your father discovered financial irregularities, evidence of human trafficking. He was gathering proof." "And Emily saw something," Richard finished. Garrett nodded. "She wandered into his home office, saw pictures on his computer. By that afternoon, Global Security had been called in to find her after she mysteriously disappeared." "But why keep her hidden for 15 years?" "Because Global Security never stopped looking for her," Garrett said. "And after your parents died in that house fire—" "Fire?" Richard interrupted. "It was an electrical fault, an accident." Garrett's silence spoke volumes. "They murdered my parents?" "I'm sorry," Garrett said quietly. "We tried to warn them." If what Garrett was saying was true, then Richard's company had been funded by settlement money from his parents' death. Money paid by the very people who had arranged their murder. "Emily knew all this?" Richard asked. "Not at first," Garrett replied, "but as she got older, she started asking questions." A young woman approached, whispering something urgently to Garrett. "They're sweeping the tunnels," he told Richard. "We need to move." "Not until you take me to Emily," Richard insisted. Garrett nodded. "That's where we're going. But understand, there's no going back to your old life after this. Once you know everything, you'll be a target too." Richard thought of his company, his penthouse, his carefully constructed life. None of it mattered compared to finding his sister. "Take me to her," he said firmly. Rain pounded against the metal roof of the abandoned boathouse. They had traveled for hours, through tunnels, back alleys, and finally across the river in a small boat. The storm had intensified, providing cover, but making the journey treacherous. Tom sat nearby on an overturned crate, the sea glass pendant clutched in his fist like a talisman. "How much longer?" Richard asked. Garrett didn't look away from the window. "When it's safe." "You said Emily saved you," Richard said to Tom. "What did you mean?" "I was in one of their places," Tom said softly, "where they keep kids before they ship them out." Richard felt sick. "Human trafficking?" Tom nodded. "Emily was working undercover. She's been helping Garrett find kids like me." Richard turned to Garrett in shock. "You've been letting my sister work undercover against child traffickers? She's barely 19. Emily makes her own choices, Garrett replied. She saved dozens of children that we couldn't reach. She's still a child herself. Not after what she's seen, Garrett said. Emily grew up fast, Richard. Don't expect the little girl from your memory. The words hit Richard hard. In his mind, Emily had remained frozen as the 4-year-old in pigtails. The reality, that she had grown into a young woman shaped by trauma and danger, was something he hadn't fully processed. When she found me, Tom continued, she told me about you. Said you used to make her feel safe. Said you were the bravest person she knew. Richard's throat tightened. I wasn't brave enough to save her. But she saved me, Tom said, and lots of others. Through the dirty windows, lightning flashed. Richard caught sight of movement on the opposite shore. Silhouettes moving through. The rain. Garrett, Richard said sharply, pointing. Garrett cursed under his breath. They found us faster than I expected. He pressed a button on a small radio. Nest is compromised. Execute Protocol Nightingale. Static answered him, then a woman's voice crackled through. Copy that. Package is ready for delivery. South Channel in 10. Garrett moved swiftly toward the back of the boathouse. We need to move. What about the others? Tom asked anxiously. Decoys, Garrett said. They'll keep global security busy while we make the extraction. Garrett pulled open a trap door, revealing a narrow ladder leading down to dark water. The river? Richard asked incredulously. Tunnel system, Garrett corrected. Maintenance passages. For the bridge supports. They run for nearly a mile under the river. Another flash of lightning illuminated the boathouse, followed by the sound of a boat engine growing closer. Now or never, Kingsley, Garrett called. Richard descended the ladder, wincing as icy water soaked through his clothes. The cold was shocking, instantly numbing his legs. Garrett pulled the trapdoor closed, plunging them into near-total darkness. A small flashlight clicked on in his hand, revealing a narrow tunnel stretching beneath the river. This way, he said, beginning to wade through the chest-deep water. Keep one hand on the wall at all times. They moved in silence. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel began to slope upward, the water level gradually decreasing. The air grew warmer, suggesting they were approaching an exit. Garrett stopped suddenly, raising a hand for silence. From somewhere ahead came the faint echo of voices. Wait here, he whispered, handing the flashlight to Tom before disappearing into the darkness. She made me memorize your face, Tom said suddenly. From photographs. So I'd recognize you when I found you. Richard looked down at the boy in surprise. How long have you been planning this? Emily's been planning it for years, Tom replied, watching you from a distance, learning about your company, your routines. But why now? What changed? She found something big. She said it was enough to bring them all down, but too dangerous to handle alone. She needed you. Garrett reappeared from the darkness. Coast is clear, he said, but we need to hurry. The exchange point is just ahead. Garrett led them to a rusted metal door set into the tunnel wall. He entered a code on a keypad hidden beneath a loose brick, and the door swung open. Beyond lay a small concrete chamber illuminated by a single overhead bulb. Standing in the center was a woman with short, dark hair and familiar green eyes flecked with gold. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Richard stared at the stranger before him, searching for traces of the little sister he had lost. Emily? He whispered, his voice breaking. She took a step forward, her expression guarded but softening. Hello, Richie, she said, using the childhood nickname only she had ever called him. Richard moved toward her, arms opening, but she stepped back, maintaining the distance between them. I'm sorry, she said, but we don't have time for reunions yet. They're closing in, and I need to show you something first. She turned to Tom with a gentle smile. You did good, buddy, just like we practiced. Tom beamed, holding out the sea glass pendant. I kept it safe, just like I promised. I knew you would, Emily said, taking the pendant and slipping it over her head. From her jacket, she withdrew a weathered leather journal. "Dad's original notes," she explained. "The ones that got our parents killed and set all this in motion." "How did you get that?" Richard asked. "I thought everything was destroyed in the fire." "Not everything," Emily replied. "Garrett saved this. He was working with Dad, trying to build a case against Global. I was undercover FBI," Garrett explained. "Your father was my confidential informant. When Global realized he was gathering evidence, they moved to eliminate the threat. I couldn't save your parents, but I got to Emily in time. Why not take her to the authorities?" "To me?" Richard demanded. "Because Global had people everywhere," Emily answered. "In the police, the FBI, even the courts. The official investigation into my disappearance was led by the very people who had taken me." A distant rumble echoed through the tunnel, followed by the sound of voices. "They're in the tunnels," Garrett said. "We need to move, now." Emily clutched the journal to her chest, her eyes meeting Richard's with intensity. "I need you to trust me," she said, "even though I'm a stranger to you now. Can you do that?" Richard looked at his sister. No longer the laughing child in pigtails, but a woman forged by tragedy and resilience. "Yes," he said simply. "I trust you." The river had carried them downstream before they managed to drag themselves onto the muddy bank beneath an abandoned railroad trestle. The storm continued unabated, providing cover from their pursuers. Richard lay on his back, gasping for breath. Beside him, Emily sat upright, alert despite their ordeal, her eyes scanning the shoreline for any sign of threat. Tom had been separated from them in the current, but Garrett had assured them the boy knew the emergency rendezvous point. "He'll be okay," Richard said, sitting up with effort. "He's resourceful." Emily's lips quirked in a small smile. "That he is. Smartest kid I've ever met." "Is he one of their victims?" Richard asked carefully. "Yes. We found him 2 years ago during a raid on one of their processing centers. He'd been there for months." Richard felt sick at the thought of what the boy must have endured. "And now he works with you?" Emily shook her head. "Not works. Lives. We're a family, Richard. All of us. The children we've rescued, the agents who defected. We take care of each other. While fighting a shadow war against a global trafficking network," Richard added. "Someone has to," Emily said simply. Garrett approached from further down the shore. "We're clear for now, but we need to keep moving. The safe house is 3 miles north." Emily helped Richard to his feet. "Haikokyu, can you make it?" she asked. Richard nodded. "I'm tougher than I look." "You'd better be," Garrett said grimly, "because the hard part hasn't even started yet." They set off along the shoreline, keeping to the shadows. The rain had plastered Richard's hair to his head, sending rivulets of water down his face. "The journal," Richard said as they walked. "What exactly is in it?" Emily glanced at the waterproof pouch she had strapped to her belt. "Names," she said. "Dates, account numbers." Dad was thorough. "He was an accountant," Richard replied. "Thoroughness was his religion." A shadow of pain crossed Emily's face. "I barely remember him," she admitted. "Or Mom. Just fragments. Feelings." "They loved you more than anything," Richard said softly. "After you disappeared, it was like all. The light went out of them. They never stopped looking." Emily was quiet for a moment. "And you?" she finally asked. "When did you stop hoping?" The question cut deep, but Richard owed her honesty. "After they died," he admitted. "I told myself you were gone too. It was easier that way." "Easier," Emily repeated, the word flat. "Not better," Richard clarified. "Just less painful than hope." They walked in silence for several minutes. "I used to watch you," Emily said, suddenly. "From a distance. I'd see you on TV, announcing some new breakthrough. You looked content." Richard thought about the life he had built, the empire of glass and silicon, the penthouse with its panoramic views. I was numb, he corrected. Not content. There's a difference. Would you go back, if you could, to that numbness? Before Richard could answer, Garrett signaled for silence, dropping into a crouch. Ahead, lights swept across the shoreline, flashlights moving in a coordinated pattern. The search had already reached this far. Into the trees, Garrett whispered. Stay. Low. Move quietly. They retreated into the dense underbrush. Richard followed Emily, marveling at how silently she moved. The vegetation grew thicker. Richard's foot caught on a hidden root, sending him sprawling. Emily was beside him instantly, helping him up. Are you hurt? She whispered. Richard's ankle throbbed with pain. It's sprained. We can't slow down, Garrett said urgently. They're fanning out, covering the woods. You two go ahead, Richard said. I'll find a place to hide. Wait it out. Emily's response was immediate and fierce. No, we stay together. Vehemence in her voice surprised Richard. After 15 years apart, he would have understood if she had been willing to. Leave him. Emily, he said gently, if they catch all of us, everything you've worked for is lost. The journal, the evidence. It's too important. She stared at him, conflict evident in her eyes. Then, with sudden determination, she unstrapped the waterproof pouch from her belt and pressed it into his hands. Then you take it, she said. Garrett and I will create a diversion. Draw them away. You get to the safe house. She pressed a small GPS device into his palm. The coordinates are programmed into this. Green dot is you. Red dot is the destination. Despite everything, Richard felt a smile tug at his lips. There was a glimpse of the spirited little sister he remembered. We'll be right behind you. She promised. But if something happens, if we don't make it, you're the only one I trust to finish this. The weight of her words struck Richard with physical force. After everything, his failure to protect her, the years of giving up hope, she still trusted him. I won't let you down, he said. Not again. Emily's expression softened. You never let me down, Richie, she whispered. I always knew you'd find me someday. A crashing sound from the underbrush nearby shattered the moment. Flashlight beams swept through the trees, moving closer. Go, Garrett urged. We'll meet at the safe house. Emily hesitated, then reached up to touch Richard's face. The pendant, she said, slipping the sea glass necklace over her head and pressing it into his hand. Keep it safe for me. Before Richard could respond, she turned and disappeared into the darkness after Garrett. Within seconds, shouts erupted from the direction they had gone, the diversion beginning. Richard clutched the pendant and journal, steeling himself against the pain in his ankle. Using a branch as a makeshift crutch, he began moving in the direction indicated by the GPS. The rain continued to fall, washing away his footprints. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant as Emily and Garrett led them away. As he walked, Richard struggled to process everything that had happened since that morning. The wallet, the photograph, the boy, and finally, incredibly, Emily, alive, transformed by her experiences into someone both familiar and foreign. The forest began to thin, giving way to an overgrown field. In the distance stood the silhouette of a small, dilapidated cabin, the safe house according to the GPS. Richard paused at the edge of the trees, scanning for danger before venturing into the open. The cabin represented safety, answers, and the chance to finally understand the truth. Taking a deep breath, Richard stepped out of the forest, the pendant clutched in one hand, the journal in the other. Each painful step brought him closer to completing the journey that had begun with a dropped wallet and a rain-soaked boy. Lightning flashed overhead, briefly illuminating the landscape. In that frozen moment, Richard saw a small figure standing. In the doorway of the cabin, Tom watching and waiting. Relief flooded through Richard. If Tom had made it safely, there was hope for Emily and Garrett too. Hope that they might all survive, that the evidence might finally bring justice, that the broken pieces of his family might somehow be mended. As he limped toward the cabin, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, a sense of purpose that went beyond profit margins and technological innovation. The sea glass pendant warmed in his palm, a tangible reminder of promises made and broken and, perhaps, renewed. Tears mingled with raindrops as he crossed the field, each step bringing him closer to the truth, to Emily, to the person he was meant to be, not just a successful man, but a brother worthy of his sister's trust. The cabin was sparse, but secure. Tom bolted the door behind Richard, then helped him to a worn couch against the far wall. "You made it," Tom said, relief evident in his voice. "I wasn't sure." "Emily and Garrett?" Richard asked, wincing as he elevated his injured ankle. Tom shook his head. "Not yet." Richard clutched the leather journal tighter. Whatever was inside had cost his parents their lives and robbed his sister of her childhood. Now it might be the only thing that could bring down the organization responsible. "We need to look at this," Richard said, holding up the journal. "Figure out what my father discovered." Tom nodded and moved to a small table, clearing space. Richard limped over, setting the journal down carefully. The leather was cracked and water-stained, but the pages inside remained intact. Richard opened it, revealing his father's meticulous handwriting. Pages of numbers, dates, and coded notations filled the journal. Between entries were names. Powerful. People connected to global security. "I can't make sense of all this," Richard admitted after several minutes. "Emily said you would know what to do with it," Tom replied. Richard studied the journal more carefully. His father had been an accountant. These were financial records, money trails. He was tracking payments, Richard realized, bribes, payoffs, blackmail, all connected to human trafficking operations. A notation caught his eye, a reference to Kingsley Tech's early seed funding. With growing horror, Richard realized that his own company had unknowingly been built with money tied to global securities operations. "They've been hiding in plain sight," Richard whispered, "using legitimate businesses as cover." The sound of approaching vehicles broke their concentration. Tom rushed to the window, peering through a gap in the boarded-up glass. 3 SUVs, he reported. Armed men spreading out around the cabin. Richard's mind raced. "Is there another way out?" "Underground passage in the back room," Tom said. "But we'll never make it before they surround us completely." Richard looked at the journal, then at the pendant in his hand. He couldn't lose either. Both were essential to finding Emily and exposing the truth. "We need to hide these," Richard said urgently. Tom immediately moved to a loose floorboard, prying it up to reveal a small compartment. "Emily's emergency cash," he explained. Richard placed the journal inside, but hesitated with the pendant. Finally, he slipped it around his own neck, tucking it beneath his shirt. Some things you don't let go of twice. A loud voice outside called through a megaphone. "Richard Kingsley, we know you're in there. Come out peacefully and no one will be hurt." "Liars," Tom muttered. Richard's mind worked furiously. These men wanted him in the journal. They didn't know about Tom. "Where exactly does that underground passage lead?" Richard asked. "Half a mile east, exits in an old storm drain." Richard nodded, a plan forming. "I'm going to surrender myself. Give you time to escape with the journal. Get it to Emily." Tom's eyes widened. "They'll kill you." "No," Richard said with more confidence than he felt. "I'm too valuable alive. They'll want to know who else I've told, what else I know. Emily would never forgive me if I left you behind." Richard placed his hands on the boy's shoulders. "You're not leaving me behind. You're completing the mission. This is bigger than either of us." The megaphone crackled again. "You have 60 seconds before we come in." Richard moved to the door. Stay hidden until they take me away. Then run. Don't stop until you find Emily." Tom looked at him with those unusual green-gold eyes so much like Emily's. "You really are as brave as she said." Richard smiled sadly. "No, just trying to make up for 15 years of failing her." He turned toward the door, hand on the knob, then paused. "Tom, who are you to Emily? Really?" Tom hesitated. "I'm her son," he said quietly. "Your nephew." The revelation struck Richard like a physical blow. The boy was 11. Emily had been just a child herself when— "Go," Tom urged, already moving toward the back room. "You have to go now." Richard opened the door, hands raised above his head. Blinding spotlights immediately fixed on him. "Richard Kingsley," a familiar voice called. Richard squinted against the light, making out a figure approaching, the detective who had handled Emily's case 15 years ago. "Detective Mercer," Richard said coldly. "Or, should I say, Global Security Operative Mercer." The man smiled thinly. "I see Emily's been catching you up. Where is she, Richard, and where's the journal?" "Safe," Richard replied simply. "Both of them." Mercer signaled to his men. Two approached Richard, securing his hands behind his back with zip ties. "Your sister has been a thorn in our side for years," Mercer said conversationally. "It would be a shame if something happened to her now, just when you found each other again." "You won't find her," Richard said with certainty. "She's been outsmarting you for 15 years. Mercer's expression hardened. "Take him," he ordered his men. "Search the cabin." As they led Richard to one of the waiting SUVs, he caught a glimpse of movement in the trees beyond the cabin, a flash of dark clothing, a familiar silhouette. Emily was out there, watching, and now she knew where he was being taken. For the first time since this journey began, Richard felt something unexpected. Not fear, but hope. The Global Security Headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Manhattan. Few knew what really happened behind its reflective glass windows. The trafficking operations coordinated, the lives destroyed, the profits made. Richard sat alone in a sterile conference room on the 47th floor, his wrists still bound. His ankle throbbed, but he barely noticed the pain. His mind was too occupied with what Tom had revealed. He had a nephew. Emily had a son. The implications were horrifying. She would have been just 8 when Tom was born. The door opened, and Mercer entered with 2 other men in expensive suits. "Mr. Kingsley," one of the men said smoothly, "I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding." "Has there?" Richard replied coldly. "Indeed. You've been manipulated by a group of domestic terrorists. The woman claiming to be your sister is an imposter." Richard laughed without humor. "Try again. She has the pendant I made for Emily's 4th birthday. She knows things only Emily could know." The men exchanged glances. The one who had spoken sighed. "We had hoped to resolve this amicably. Your company's technological innovations have been very useful to certain aspects of our operation." "My company," Richard said, realization dawning. "That's why you let me build it, why you arranged for my parents' life insurance to provide startup funds. You've been using my technology to aid your trafficking operation." The man smiled thinly. "Your facial recognition software has been particularly valuable in tracking merchandise." Richard felt physically ill. His life's work had been used to perpetuate the very evil his father had died trying to expose. "Where is your missing journal, Mr. Kingsley?" Mercer demanded, abandoning pretense. "Safe," Richard replied, "along with copies of everything inside it, ready to be sent to every major news outlet if anything happens to me or my sister." It was a bluff, but the men didn't know that. Richard watched uneasiness flicker across their faces. Suddenly, the lights in the conference room flickered, then went out completely. Emergency lights activated, casting the room in an eerie red glow. "What's happening?" one of the men demanded. A security alarm began to wail throughout the building. Mercer's radio crackled with frantic reports of a breach on multiple floors. "Sir, we're under attack," a panicked voice reported. "They're everywhere." The conference room door burst open. Garrett stood in the doorway, gun raised. Behind him, Richard caught glimpses of chaos. Men and women in tactical gear overwhelming Global. Security's forces. "Time to go," Garrett said, moving quickly to cut Richard's restraints. "How did you—" Richard began. "We've been planning this raid for years," Garrett explained. "Just needed the right distraction to get their leadership in one place." Ira reached for his weapon, but Garrett was faster. A single shot dropped Mercer to the floor. "Emily," Richard asked urgently. "Securing the server room," Garrett replied, "making sure they can't wipe evidence. Tom is with her." Richard followed Garrett through the corridors of Global Security's headquarters, past scenes of the organization's downfall. FBI agents, real ones this time, were taking control of each floor, arresting stunned executives and security personnel. They found Emily in a large server room, Tom at her side. She was downloading files, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Got it," she announced triumphantly. "Every transaction, every victim, every corrupt official, it's all here." She turned, seeing Richard for the first time. Without hesitation, she crossed the room and embraced him tightly. "You survived," she whispered. "So did you," Richard replied, holding her close. "You always do." Emily pulled back, studying his face. "Tom told you?" Richard nodded, glancing at the boy, his nephew. "We have a lot to talk about." "Later," Emily promised. "First, we finish this." As dawn broke over the city, Richard stood with Emily, Tom, and Garrett on the roof of the building, watching as FBI helicopters circled overhead. Below, news vans were already gathering, alerted by anonymous tips about a major human trafficking ring being dismantled. "What happens now?" Richard asked. Emily smiled, a real smile that, for just a moment, reminded him of the little girl in pigtails from long ago. "Now," she said, taking his hand in hers. "Now we go home. Together." Richard felt the sea glass pendant against his chest, warm from his skin. He had followed a lost photograph through rain and darkness, across years of separation and grief, to this moment of redemption. As the new day dawned, Richard took his sister's hand and his nephew's shoulder, following the trail at last into the light.